Hello and welcome to another episode of Policyverse. Today, we will be discussing an issue that is becoming increasingly contentious, the procedure for the appointment of the judges in the higher judiciary. We will be looking at the rationale behind the NJAC, its constitutionality, and also whether it is the panacea for the issues in the appointment procedure that we have seen so far. I am Sumedha and I am joined by our General Secretary Dr. Jayaprakash Narayan for today's discussion. Welcome, Dr. JP.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, sir. Sir, to begin with, could you give us a sense of why you felt that the appointment procedure in the higher judiciary needed to be reformed? You and FDR and Lok Satta have been at the forefront of the effort to bring in the 99th constitutional amendment, having begun the work way back in the early 2000s. What were the problems that needed to be fixed?
Sumedha, no serious lover of liberty argues against independence of judiciary.
Right.
It is the minimum requirement to run a functioning democracy and to have a system of rule of law. And those of us who lived through emergency, who saw the terrible judicial pronouncements like in Shukla versus ADM Jabalpur, in which the court, to its eternal regret, said that the executive during emergency could do pretty much what it pleases without any recourse to the citizens. That means the fundamental rights no longer exist. And a person in uniform could shoot and kill and there's no recourse to citizen. Later, of course, the several members of the court, the judges, they regretted that. Given the failure of judiciary to protect the citizens' liberties during that time, and given the executive excesses from time to time in our country, every serious lover of liberty wants the court to be strong, the court to be independent, the court to be credible, the court to be accountable, the court to be honest, and the court to be competent. And therefore, the quality of judges appointed and the way they're held to account is incredibly important. It's not enough to say an institution is independent. Now, undoubtedly, the constitution makers thought about this, but they left it to the wisdom of the executive at a point of time, and they provided for consultation with the Chief Justice of India. And the executive did not always make very good appointments, it's a fact. There was a talk at one point of time about committed judiciary, about confrontation with the judges, and about superseding the judges, most judges and competent and credible judges, for consideration for the Chief Justice just because they were not the government of the day was not comfortable with them or their judicial pronouncements. All these things happen. But the answer does not lie in creating an unaccountable judiciary. Because in a democracy, you like it or not, the legitimacy of every institution and functionary must be directly or indirectly traced to the people of the country. Democracy is not a very nice thing. It's often a messy thing. It's like making a sausage, as they say. If you actually are there in a kitchen while making a sausage, you probably would not eat it. That's the way it is. Human affairs, in the bulk, are pretty messy, pretty complicated. But we have to go through that. Because the source of power in a democracy is the citizen and nobody else. If her will is not considered, if the people become irrelevant in the functioning of any institution of democracy, it ceases to be a democracy. For instance, you take a country like Iran, the supreme leader whom nobody elected, in a theocratic regime, he appoints the head of the judiciary, the Chief Justice equivalent, who in turn appoints all judges in the whole judicial branch of government. That means, in effect, he is accountable to only one person, not to the people. The supreme leader, currently Ayatollah Khamenei, earlier Ayatollah Khamenei. The parliament, the people, they have nothing to do with that. You cannot have that in a democracy. In our country, the only person elected by the people of India at the state level is a legislator, at the national level is a member of parliament. And if the parliament is excluded, directly or indirectly, because from the parliament comes the executive branch of government, the prime minister and the cabinet, they come from the parliament. Only when they command a majority. Therefore, they have the legitimacy of the parliament. So it has to be either directly the parliament or indirectly the executive, therefore indirectly the parliament and the people. Any other form of legitimacy is absolutely not there in our system. Secondly, if salt loseth its flavor, who will salt the salt, as Shakespeare famously said? If the judiciary itself commits mistakes, and if it's totally impervious to any kind of inputs from the executive and legislature, and then unaccountable to the people, then who will correct the judiciary? You will have unelected dictatorship in the country. Thirdly, judicial appointments, after the judiciary has usurped this jurisdiction in 1993 and subsequently, they have not been very edifying. Almost every single judge in the country, after retirement, made this comment, sometimes while in office. In fact, in the 2015 judgment, out of the 5 judges, 1 judge opposed the judicial appointments through the judiciary, or directly by the judiciary, in the form of the Collegium. Out of the 4 other judges who supported the Collegium, 2 expressed serious reservations. Justice Kehar, in much of the judgment, he argued against the functioning of the Collegium. He said there were so many wrong things happening, it's not satisfactory. However, let us still persist with that. And Justice Kurian Joseph, he said it's unaccountable, oftentimes it's not transparent, etc. However, it's not irremediable. It can still be corrected. Therefore, let us correct it rather than removing it. So even they were not very comfortable, even in judicial pronouncements. In such a situation, we have to have a robust mechanism which ensures independence, integrity and competence, and democratic accountability. And that's why we decided to look at that very closely. And we requested 3 eminent juries. Almost any serious student of law in the country, or advocate or judge, would regard these 3 as perhaps 3 of the most eminent and respected juries in the past 50, 60 years. Justice Venkatachalaya, still with us, the former Chief Justice of India. Justice J.S. Verma, he is no more, a great friend of ours, a man of unimpeachable integrity, who incidentally gave this judgment. The 93 judgment was his, and probably 98, I'm not very sure about that. So he was the author of the whole thing, but he understood the damage done by unaccountable judiciary. He also understood that how oftentimes, once a judge is appointed, is completely unaccountable, there could be serious dangers, and there are whispers, more than whispers, of corruption, abuse of power, and so on and so forth in judiciary also. And then Justice V.R. Krishna Iyer, a very eminent, one of the most revered judges of this country. We requested all these 3 to come together and then come up with a solution to help the country. We kept the major parties in the loop. The then party in power at that time, Congress UPA, was in power. Then the opposition in the loop, the NDA or the BJP, all the senior leaders were kept in the picture at every point of time. All the documents were shared with them, a very transparent process. And this committee labored considerably and came up, I think, sometime in 2003, if I'm not mistaken, with a recommendation. They recommended a 5-member National Judicial Commission. The Prime Minister or his nominee, but chaired by the Vice President of India, because they felt it requires when the Chief Justice of India and the Prime Minister involved, it must not be seen to be executive is nominating or judiciary is nominating. Therefore, put somebody, you can't put the President there, he's the appointing authority, and President of the Republic. Therefore, Vice President, they thought, is the appropriate authority. So the Vice President chairing, the Prime Minister, and 3 members of the judiciary, the Chief Justice and 2 of the senior most judges. So with a majority of judiciary. There's absolutely no cause to be unhappy with that. And later, all parties came together. When the amendment was drafted, 9th Amendment, they slightly amended this. 3 judges, Chief Justice and 2 judges were retained. The Law Minister was given the place to 4. Chief Justice was made the chairman. Instead of 1 more member from the government, they actually said 2 members, 2 laypersons, eminent citizens, chosen by a committee of the Prime Minister, Chief Justice, and Leader of Opposition. It's not the executive that's appointing. To reject that is not a particularly wise thing. And one last point, the Supreme Court of India is not only the last court of appeal, not only the federal court and the constitutional court of India, it's also vital to protect the integrity of the nation and the constitutional process and complex issues in a fractious country. We are the most diverse country on earth. So many languages, regions, religions, castes. Supposing division of a state, Andhra, Telangana, we had all kinds of strife.
Yes.
Supposing disputes on Kaveri River, Karnataka and Tamil Nadu, once in a while there's a tremendous amount of excitement and hyperpolarization and all kinds of difficulties. Ram Janmabhoomi Ayodhya dispute, Babri Masjid dispute, or take reservations, one of the most contentious issues. There is no way through political process alone they can be resolved. Because in a partisan process, when you can mobilize a certain group in your favor, another party can mobilize another in their favor, another group, you cannot find a meaningful solution which people of India can live with. That's when the court must be available. In case of reservations, all right, you must reconcile both the needs of running the state, the competence and merit, and the affirmative action policies required for the underprivileged sections. In case of Hindu-Musliman dispute, or in case of Kaveri dispute, you need some organ of credibility. And once it's given to that body and that body is trusted, the detail is not important for the people. We live with that judgment because we need that as a country. Supposing the court is no longer seen as trusted, supposing the court loses its credibility, what is the option for the country? You want to go to the United Nations about internal disputes in the country between two groups or two regions or two languages?
Right.
So by court overreaching itself, thinking that they're doing a grand job, they're actually undermining India's future, undermining our constitution. I have no doubt whatsoever.
Right.
And it's offensive to democratic sensibilities. While we respect judiciary, we respect the election commission, we respect the public service commission, we respect the CAG, their independence should be protected. It does not mean that they are independent of the democratic process of India.
Right.
It does not mean they're independent of the will of the people of India. It's a very dangerous tendency.
Sir, so from what I gather, there is a need for reform on several counts. So it's a matter of principle, tracing it to the democratic will of the people, and also how it's been functioning over the years as well. Sir, you mentioned how the court disagreed with including the two eminent people in the composition of the NJAC. Sir, so there I think the bone of contention was that two lay persons, who could be anybody, can override the judicial component in the NJAC, because the NJAC Act says that if any two persons in the commission do not agree to the recommendation, they cannot make the recommendation. So what is your response to the court's objection to that?
No, we are sometimes, Sumetha, acting as if India were alone in the whole universe. On planet Earth, there's no other nation, there's no other democratic practice, there's no other constitutional democracy in the world, which is nonsensical. Actually, our democracy is patterned after other democracies. We borrowed much of it from British practices and principles, some of it from Ireland, the directive principles, etc., some of it from the United States, the separation of powers doctrine, and so on and so forth. So we simply learned from others and indigenized some of the things. Let's look at the practices in almost all democracies worth the name.
Okay.
Take the UK. Out of the 15 members, 6 are lay persons appointed by a panel, and 5 are judges. And 4 are from the advocates community, the lawyers and the attorneys and barristers, justice of peace, etc., and 1 tribal member. And the appointing authority, namely the secretary, justice, he can reject a name, recommend it. He cannot reject a second name, and he can send a name for reconsideration. A name rejected cannot be considered by this committee. So how is that undemocratic? And many of our practices are borrowed from Britain, right?
Yes.
Take Canada. Canada has a federal system like ours. In Canada, there's a Judicial Advisory Committee appointed by a 1988 law. Now, the Supreme Court appointments are only by the Prime Minister in consultation with the Minister of Justice. This committee has no role. Other courts, all other federal courts, there is a 7-member Judicial Appointments Committee, 3 lawyers, 3 laypersons, 1 judge. And these appointments, once they recommend, by and large, they're honored, though it's not mandatory, but they're generally honored. I agree. Once a decision is made by that kind of a body in a transparent manner, ordinarily it should be honored. Even Britain also, ordinarily they honor, but they reject it, it's rejected. Second time they will not reject. That's kind of a thing. You take, for instance, the United States. Supreme Court, we all know. The Supreme Court has no role in appointing its successors. The 9 judges have no role at all, or 8 judges to appoint 1 person. We all know it is advice and consent. The President nominates, the Senate considers. And without Senate approval, it's not confirmed. US states, again there are commissions. Typically, take New York State, there are 12-member commission for appointing, for recommending nominations. 4 by the governor, the executive, 4 by the legislature, 4 by the judiciary. All 3 equally sharing. The 12 members examine and send the names for the governor. And after that, in most states, they get 1 or 2 years probation. After that, they are put to the people's vote, yes or no vote. It's not an election, but they already served for an year or 2, yes or no vote. You take France. France has a unitary system. There's a Council Superior Magistrature, the CSM it's called, the President, Minister of Justice, then 3 citizens appointed by the President and the legislature, then 1 judge from the Administrative Court, 5 judges. These are the people. Now, appointment, the highest appellate court, etc., appointed and made by this body, the President can refuse, but generally honors. You take Germany, another federal country. Germany has a complex model, 33 members, Minister of Justice at the national level, 16 from states, all representing the state legislatures or the state governments, 16 from the federal parliament. Not a single member from judiciary. Not a single member.
Right.
Thereafter, a due process finalized, and that by and large is honored. Removal is entirely given to Constitutional Court. It's not given to political authority. But appointment is entirely by this process. Take South Africa. A democracy which was patterned after, they looked at Indian democracy, many other democracies, finally a robust federal democracy is created. They have a 23-member body, of which 3 are judges. 10 are from the executive, or from the legislature, 5 from the executive, 4 from the bar, 1 from the universities. 23 members. Only 3 judges. So you go anywhere in the world, this argument that if you have 1 or 2 lay persons, that too in whose selection the Chief Justice has a role, along with leader of opposition, it's not acceptable, is, pardon me for being a little strong, absurd. Absurd. Only in India, when we feign constitutional ignorance or constitutional illiteracy, we pretend that this is the way things happen. Can this kind of an argument be even remotely accepted? Any serious student of democracy or constitution cannot accept the notion that lay persons have no role. It's the lay persons who elect our leaders. It's the lay persons who vote. It's the lay persons that are the sovereigns. I'm not saying the lay persons must elect the judges. If you have such contempt for anybody other than the judges, you think that they alone have are the ultimate repositories of wisdom or integrity, then I think you're talking of divinity. You're talking of a theocracy, you're not talking of democracy. No institution, no individual can be treated as divine. Everybody is subject to popular will, directly or indirectly. Everybody must derive a democratic legitimacy, and everybody must be accountable ultimately. Today what happened? A High Court judge is appointed in this non-transparent way without any democratic element. Once appointed, that person gets all the protection of the Constitution and cannot be removed. While legally there is a provision to remove, in reality after the Ramaswamy impeachment case's failure in 1993, no judge was removed. After that, in fact, no judge's case went up to Parliament for even voting. And now it's universally accepted that once appointed, a judge will not be removed no matter what.
Right.
So what have you created? You created an utterly theocratic regime, unaccountable, undemocratic.
Right.
And oftentimes, everybody knows the appointments are less than satisfactory.
Right.
So it's impossible to argue that this is the best way to run the country.
Sir, so in your opinion, what would be the contours of independence or an independent judiciary? Because in the 2015 judgment that they struck down the 99th Amendment in, they said that primacy of judiciary in the appointment procedure is an integral part of ensuring independence of judiciary.
With due respect, that's a self-serving judgment.
Right.
I must be very candid about that. Where in the Constitution did it say that?
Right.
Have you got a divine law which whispered in your ears, independent of the Constitution makers? In fact, the Constituent Assembly discussed whether the appointment should be in concurrence with the Chief Justice or in consultation with. After due deliberation, the Assembly said in consultation, not in concurrence.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
So now, after an issue was discussed and very carefully certain words are inserted, you are now trying to tell the people of India that you know better than the constitution makers of India, and you can rewrite the Constitution. Interpreting the Constitution is different from rewriting the Constitution. Nobody on earth gave the judiciary the power to rewrite the Constitution.
Right.
You cannot accept that. Secondly, the basic structure doctrine of the principles is all right. There are some people who are uncomfortable even with that. But what are the principles? Universal franchise, fundamental rights, federalism, independent judiciary. And that's just maybe independent constitutional authority. That's about it. You cannot micromanage. You cannot leave open the room and the space for interpreting in 150 ways and depend in the case and now this is basic structure.
Right.
Now this is basic structure. Tomorrow somebody will say, a judge getting 2 cars is a basic structure. What is this?
Right.
Are we in a constitutional democracy or a Tughlaq democracy? It can't be whimsical. So basic features doctrine itself is questionable by some people. I agree. I personally agree that basic features doctrine is a good thing. Provided you clearly and narrowly define what are the basic features. In my judgment, the Republican form of government, universal franchise, democracy, rule of law, federalism, independent judiciary and independent constitutional authorities. These are the basic features. No more and no less. If you add too many individual features, which can be amended at will whenever the legislature decides so, then you're no longer talking about basic features. You're talking about the rule of the judges, even in legislation. That's not right. So somehow imparting this divinity to the judges is a very dangerous thing.
So where do we draw the boundaries when it comes to independence of judiciary?
So what is independence? Independence in functioning. Today, normatively, judges are utterly independent. That they're not delivering is a different matter. There are umpteen number of cases where judges are still not delivering, despite independence. Partly because of external factors, the judges' strength, the infrastructure, the technology, resources. Partly because of the laws and procedures. Partly because of the judiciary's unwillingness to actually deliver justice to the country. It's a combination of factors. What I'm not saying entirely is judiciary's fault. But nobody can argue that the executive or legislature has the power to influence the judges. If they want to be influenced, it is not because there is a compulsion to be influenced. Because once appointed, you have a lifelong tenure. You are more or less irremovable. The Constitution provides a very complex mechanism which is extraordinarily rare, and in India it never worked. So where there is no independence? Independence in operation. And appointment, we don't want whimsical appointments of the Prime Minister of India either.
Right.
We want an accountable, democratic, preferably with a transparent process.
Right.
In some countries, for instance, there's a very transparent, very public process in the judicial appointments. South Africa has a very transparent, public hearings are there, public interviews are conducted, so that it's not somebody's private judgment that I like him.
Right.
Oftentimes, what's happening? Somebody made a point that a significant proportion of the judges appointed are the sons and sons-in-laws and nephews of the sitting judges. That's not a particularly edifying spectacle in a country like India. Is there no talent elsewhere in the country? And there are many people I've known while in government, many names recommended of people of very questionable integrity, to say the least. I personally have seen. I intervened in certain positions where it was necessary to intervene, and then tried to get it corrected. So let's not pretend that what's happening is nice. It's not. So independence is required in terms of competence, in terms of delivery of justice, uninfluenced by, unencumbered by external factors. But it also means that the quality of judges must be good. But the best way to ensure that, apart from having an independent body getting the inputs from the legislature and the executive without anybody asserting dominance, we also require to get a very high quality talent pool, because the finest advocates are not particularly enamored by judicial work in this country. So a national the Indian Judicial Service, for which there was a provision in the Constitution, it was specifically mentioned in the Constitution. And we have to get it so that the lure of all India services, in India there's a tremendous amount of attraction for the all India services. If you create an all India service in that manner, if the finest young people, they compete for the judicial service positions and they become the recruiting ground for the higher courts, I think that's a good thing. The constitution makers already provided for independence. For instance, pre-independence India, the ICS officers became judges in most cases. Now, they did not come back from judiciary to the executive again. But even that limited thing that they went from executive to judiciary was regarded as something negative. Pre-1973 CRPC, the civil officers, administrators, they functioned as judges in many circumstances. Even today, actually, in scheduled areas, in tribal areas in some states, for civil cases, the judiciary or judicial work is in the hands of the executive magistrates. But we, by and large, separated that. So already, all those things are done. In, for instance, monitoring prosecution or even crime investigation, ensuring that police don't act as partisan tools of those in power, I believe judiciary must be given greater role. I'm actually a great advocate of a commission for prosecution and investigation in each state, headed by judiciary, and totally uncontrolled, untrammeled by political interference. You separate crime investigation from other branches of policing, at least crimes above a certain threshold, and bring it under broad judicial control. I'm completely in favor. I'm in favor of bringing judges as prosecutors, district prosecutors for a tenure. Already we have practice of judges going as law secretaries in several states. I have known several of them. They went back again, became judges, later high court judges, etc. So you can make them prosecutors, but as judges. They continue to be part of judiciary, but here they function as prosecutors, go back to judiciary again. See, all these are necessary. They are worthwhile, but not judicial monopoly, not judicial tyranny, not judicial usurpation of all executive and legislative functions. These are two different things. Let us not use the guise of independence of judiciary or independence of crime investigation to say that judiciary are the monarchs of India. Nobody is a monarch of India. Not the Prime Minister, not the Chief Minister, not the Speaker of the House, not the Chief Justice. Nobody should be the monarch of India.
Point that you were making, that many of the judges themselves are unhappy with the current appointment procedure, but they say that it can be corrected or it can be improved upon. But that brings me to the larger question of democracy and constitutionalism. Irrespective of whether or not the current system is working or not, shouldn't the parliament have the authority to change the procedure if it wants to?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Parliament should not have the authority to change fundamental rights.
Yes.
The basic structure we discussed. Should not have the authority to say, we are no longer a republican democracy, we'll create a monarch. Should not make India a theocracy. Should not undermine federalism of India. Should not undermine the independence of courts and the constitutional authorities. Barring that, anything else, whatever is required under the circumstances of the people's mandate, the parliament is and should be free to decide. I have absolutely no doubt about it. That's why political process is messy.
Right.
Oftentimes in a country like India, where we have still not internalized the true notions of democracy, or democracy is reduced to voting and shouting. Voting is often determined by vote buying in many states. We all know that. Let's not pretend it doesn't exist. That is, in fact, the dominant form of capturing the vote. Both parties are as many parties as are seriously competing distribute money and other favors in a significant measure, and only then are they taken as serious candidates. Then dividing people on caste, region, religion, language, other grounds, polarizing the people because that is the best way of political mobilization in a country like India, when the governments are not able to deliver effectively, or offering all kinds of freebies, neglecting the government's core functions of rule of law, education, healthcare, infrastructure, etc. All these are happening. But these are distortions of a dysfunctional democracy still in early stages. 70 years, while it's long, it's not long enough. It takes time. And we have to keep on improving our democratic institutions to make the people understand the value of the vote. If you despair of democracy, and if you want to take things away from the elected representative, it's no longer a democracy then.
Right.
It becomes an elite Raj. It is the Platonic republic where he believes the masses are no good. Now, good or bad, we have chosen universal franchise and democracy.
Right.
There was a debate whether Indians should get universal franchise from day one. Ambedkar and others quite rightly argued if we deny the people on grounds of poverty or illiteracy franchise, then the elites will guarantee perpetuation of their hold over society. Unless the people who are deprived of all the advantages by birth and don't have money or education, unless they also are partners in this equally, how will they rise? How will their interests be protected? That is a logic, an impeccable logic. That's a democratic logic. Now, today, if you want to ignore the people as a whole and say they are useless, we will decide. It's illegitimate, undemocratic. It may be a system. There are countries which adopt that system. The Communist Party of China decides who the judges are. That's a country. The people may be happy or unhappy. It's their choice. That's not the choice people of India made. That's not the choice the constitution makers of India made. And nobody in government, whether executive or legislature or judiciary, has a right to now unmake our fundamental choices as a democracy. We are forgetting that because of our vexation with democracy, the democratic culture or democratic practice as we see. We want to throw the baby with the bathwater. Our democracy is definitely flawed. I have been shouting from rooftops for 27 years about the failings of our democracy. But the only antidote to the failings of a democracy is more democracy and better democracy, greater accountability and transparency, not less transparency and accountability and not undermining democracy. That's a disaster.
Sir, talking about how our democracy is distortionary also. Sir, you often quote Justice Venkatachalaya and say that ours is a system of compensatory errors. Sir, in a political economy that's highly distortionary, where those in public office seldom act in public interest, there's corruption, there is influence peddling, there is crony capitalism. And on the other hand, we also have a highly insulated judiciary. In a system where we have guaranteed expansive constitutional rights and against the state. Sir, to be the devil's advocate, would something like an NJAC giving the executive a role in appointing judges, would that upset the balance even if it's distortionary?
It will actually restore the balance. Now it is distortionary and dysfunctional.
Right.
See, even if the constitutional principle is not fully upheld, supposing in practice it's working out beautifully, we can say, all right, let us weigh the pros and cons. Now, we are losing both, the principle and the practice.
Right.
See, Justice Venkatachalaya's admonition was very wise. In fact, in a private conversation when he was the chairman of the National Commission to Review the Working of the Constitution, I was making a very strong plea. It's not a private conversation, official conversation, but one-to-one conversation for independent crime investigation, autonomy of the police. Then he cautioned me, Dr. Jayaprakash, ours is a system of compensatory errors. What he meant was, undoubtedly, in most police stations of India, the political parties and politicians are applying pressure in crime investigation. Wrong principle. Therefore, insulating crime investigation from political vagaries is absolutely vital. But only if and only if, the policemen are accountable and they don't abuse power. If the police force habitually, culturally, right from colonial days, is habituated to third degree, most often if you are without money, without lawyer's presence, we cannot hire a lawyer, don't have political clout, most often the people accused of petty theft and crimes, they are beaten black and blue in many police stations in India. It's a fact. Let's not pretend otherwise. Our society's culture, even today, somebody stole something, you go and beat him up.
Right.
You see so many stories every day. Because we are just now emerging from a feudal culture. Now, if that goes unchecked, if there is no efficient modern crime investigation without torture,
Right.
without the possibility of police doctoring evidence, now removing some kind of political pressure actually is going to be destructive. Because in India, often the distortions of one branch of government are set right by the distortions of another branch.
Right.
In a sensible system, both must be healthy,
Right.
setting right.
Yeah.
And therefore, we should ensure there is independent crime investigation, but only if there is total accountability and transparency in police functioning. That's why we are arguing for a state level independent police the commission, or whatever name you call it, a commission to monitor investigation, and all appointments and transfers and postings in crime investigation will be under their control, not political control. It will be insulated from the law and order police and other police, which will be under the government, the political branch of the government. Let it be so. And they will be guided by this body, and there will be a prosecutorial thing by the same commission headed.
Right.
Probably a district judge is heading the district prosecution. So you have to have intricate links in order to ensure that there is no abuse of power. Power is prone to be abused universally. And as Lord Acton said famously, absolute power will be abused.
Right.
Inevitably. That's the logic of power. In fact, power, as somebody said, has no content without abuse. So you must not trust anybody, not the Supreme Court, not the police chief. For instance, Supreme Court, for instance, gave a well-meaning order that the police chief let him be appointed by a body, the chief minister, opposition leader, etc. And after that, let him be totally unchallenged. It hasn't worked. All states are pretending they're going by that order, but we all know the reality. It's absurd. It's absurd because you have to have very nuanced, very sometimes complicated, intricate arrangement in order to ensure both efficacy and accountability and overall guaranteeing fairness. So there is no Tughlaq's decision, you do this and this will happen. There's no such thing. There are no simple, straightforward answers. I have seen in New South Wales in Australia, I went as part of the Administrative Reforms Commission, the intricate mechanisms they created for police accountability and efficacy. It's amazing. So that is the important thing, that admonition. Ours is the system of compensatory errors. Let's not pretend that there are simple, direct answers. I do this and everything is set right. It is a nonsensical notion and a dangerous notion.
Sir, so do you see any chance or an opportunity of something like an NJAC coming into?
Eventually, not today.
Okay.
My own sense is it will take another 15, 20 years.
Okay.
Because let's be truthful, the people of India, the middle classes and the media and the intelligentsia, they are vexed with democracy in general. While we all pay lip sympathy to democracy,
Right.
I'm saying this with all sincerity. If an opportunity is really available, I suspect that most of the elites of India will give up on democracy.
Right.
Let's be truthful. In such a climate, there is no trust in the executive branch of government or in the political wing of the government, elected branch of the government, which is sad. But right now, that is the truth. And parties themselves don't trust each other. While 99th Amendment was universally approved in Parliament with one exception, Ram Jethmalani is the lone dissenter. Every party, UPA, NDA, Congress, BJP, everybody approved. Congress initiated the process. NDA continued the process. Successive law ministers were actively involved. And eminent people like Venkatachalaya, J.S. Verma and Krishna Iyer, they were all involved. So after all that, what happened at the end of the day? Once the Supreme Court gave an ill-advised order, the Parliament refused to be united. In fact, I have letters from major opposition parties, I don't want to go into names now, from the party chiefs themselves in writing with their signature saying that we initiated the process, we continue to be committed to that. But once the judgment came, politics played a role. So in such a system where the parties don't trust each other,
Right.
the elites don't trust the parties and the political process, I suspect for the time being, the National Judicial Commission or bringing some sanity to judicial appointments is a losing battle, but only for the time being. As democracy matures, as people realize the importance of true rule of law, as people realize that democratic accountability, but designed in a proper manner, is the only way out, that will happen eventually. Otherwise, our democracy will completely be destroyed. That will probably take another 15, 20 years. Then I think this will be revisited in a serious way and we'll find a viable answer. Meanwhile, this is more a matter of debate in my judgment. 2015 Supreme Court should have utilized the opportunity, but they squandered it, unfortunately. Now, unless the Supreme Court is willing to constitute a larger bench and judicial wisdom prevails and they recognize the long-term interests of the country and the court, I mentioned to you the importance of a credible Supreme Court, interstate disputes, water disputes, Hindu-Musliman disputes, reservation, other issues, very contentious issues, how the Supreme Court's credibility is going to be vital. So if they recognize their credibility as the most important thing and therefore don't usurp jurisdiction and undermine credibility, if they have that kind of wisdom collectively, a 9 judgment tomorrow, for instance, that's one way. If that doesn't happen, I think it will take another 20 years for the parliament to actually do the right thing and get the acceptability or acceptance of the people. Because parliament, even if it does, that the people generally oppose it, why will political parties cooperate?
Sir, so you talked about the All India Judicial Service and the reforms required in the rule of law in police and prosecution. So if, let's say, the NJAC, there's no scope for it happening in the next decade or so, what are the other areas when it comes to the judiciary?
One is Indian Judicial Service, as I mentioned. I am, in general, not a great fan of All India services. I don't believe All India services is an answer to problems. If anything, All India services require to be restructured. When the recruitment process is good, the monopoly or all key public offices, the lack of specialization, very general kind of a knowledge, but no domain expertise in a very complex, ever-changing world, and the lifelong security with very little accountability, these 3 things undermine the All India services outcomes. While the recruitment is about the best people, because after all, intense competition in a country where there's so much of lure of these offices, that did not really yield us good dividends. Individual officers have been performing excellently, but collectively, I don't think the system is working. We have to bring about changes. I'm not a great fan of creating more All India services, but judiciary is one area where we require to look at it because we have to attract the finest talent. We are not getting the finest talent into judiciary. Let's be truthful. The best lawyers are very well compensated with all the freedom, without all these hassles, and therefore they prefer to have their freedom and professional satisfaction without becoming judges. Very rarely do really top-class lawyers want to become judges. When that is the case, attracting them and creating a recruiting pool for the higher judiciary and even improving the quality of trial courts is very important. The second thing is, as I mentioned, the police reform in terms of rule of law, not only civil and procedural reforms, but also insulating crime investigation and creating an independent mechanism broadly under judicial supervision, including prosecution. And the third thing that we should look at is procedural laws. Because procedural laws are very archaic and everybody knows the number of years the cases are taking and therefore justice delayed being justice denied and so on and so forth. There's a whole lot of area that requires to be deeply examined. So there are several issues that require to be thoroughly overhauled, and it's not difficult. World over, we have plenty of examples. Let me reiterate what I said again. We are not the only democracy on earth. We are not that lonely. Others have wrestled through them, found out solutions, each country in its own way. We can indigenize those solutions, but the basic principles apply here too. We are not so unique. For instance, local court system to dispense speedy justice for simple cases. The courts are cluttered. Why should a simple affray or simple harassment of a girl, a simple theft or something, why should that be gone through a very complex process and take years and years? You can dispose it off in a week by summary procedure, as long as the offense is below a certain threshold. So there are so many easy, low-hanging fruit if we apply our minds. But somehow we talk too big and we do too little.
Sir, reforms in the appointment process is one thing, but what about ensuring accountability of judges while they are in service?
It's a great question. The only provision under the Constitution under Article 124 is impeachment and removal. As we discussed before, it never worked.
Right.
It's unlikely to work in future. Therefore, it's no longer a deterrent.
Right.
Far too many judges, their conduct is questionable now in India. While the subordinate courts, the trial courts, judiciary, is entirely under the high courts under Article 235. In some states, notably Maharashtra about 2 decades ago, later Rajasthan, West Bengal to some extent, and some other states, the very proactive, very competent and honest Chief Justices, they made special efforts to clean up judiciary. And in any case, a High Court Chief Justice and the High Court itself is fully empowered if they want to improve the quality of subordinate judiciary. Therefore, let's not worry about that.
Right.
It's the failing of the High Courts because there's no constitutional impediment. Higher courts, because the failure of Article 124, it's not working. So short of this, what do we need to do? Already an answer is available. Justice J.S. Verma's court, when he brought the Chief Justices of the High Courts together, they came up with a conduct of judicial court. And then, based on that, a National Judicial Standards bill was contemplated. Judicial Standards and Accountability, codifying the judicial standards of conduct and accountability mechanism.
Right.
A permanent, independent mechanism comprising of judges is sought to be created so that complaints, today there is no mechanism. So any credible complaints against these judges can be examined by this body by due process. It's a judicial body without any external. Here, there should not be any executive or legislative role because it's a judicial process, examining the conduct of a person and determining whether or not the person is suitable for public office, for judicial office. So let it be entirely judicial, but in a transparent manner, the due process and so on and so forth. And if it is short of removal that is required, then whether transfer or censure or whatever, that will be within the province of that body. If it requires removal, let them make a recommendation to the president. And normally, if after that due process a recommendation is made, chances are that the parliament will be able to act in a bipartisan manner. And the fear that the parliament may therefore act, and this commission's word will be of enormous value, itself will be a safeguard. That itself will be a corrective for the judges. It will act as a deterrent. So I think Judicial Standards and Accountability Bill, with such appropriate changes as required, it's long overdue to enact that into legislation and create a permanent, robust mechanism to address the complaints against judges.
Thank you so much, sir. I think this discussion would have given our viewers a lot to think about. Thank you again.